I never thought a Sunday brunch could feel like a public execution, but that's exactly what it became. The house itself was absurdly beautiful, all glass walls and polished wood, sitting right on the edge of the lake, the kind of place where everything smells like money and restraint. Nearly 50 people were there, extended family, business friends, people I barely knew but was expected to smile at anyway. I already felt out of place before anything happened, standing there with a mimosa I didn't really want, listening to conversations about investment properties and private schools. My son had been quiet all morning, unusually so, and I told myself it was just teenage moodiness. I should have known better. When he stood up, the room naturally hushed. At first I thought he was going to make some awkward toast or joke. Instead, he cleared his throat and looked directly at me, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of rehearsed confidence that made my stomach drop. He started talking about finding his identity, about moving forward, about not wanting to be tied to things that no longer represented who he was. The words were polished, practiced, like something he'd said out loud many times before but never to me. Then he said it. He said he didn't want my last name anymore. I felt heat rush to my face as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He kept going, gaining momentum, praising his stepfather for being ambitious, modern, successful, someone who understood the world as it is now. Then he looked back at me and said I was irrelevant, that I was stuck in the past, that my name meant nothing to him anymore. Every word landed like it had been sharpened. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even look away. I could hear my own pulse in my ears and the faint clink of silverware as someone nervously set down a fork. Laura, my ex-wife, didn't look surprised. She smiled, slowly, and raised her glass as if this were some brave, artistic performance instead of a son tearing his father apart in front of an audience. She said something about self-expression and growth, her tone light and approving, as though she were moderating a panel discussion rather than witnessing a deeply personal humiliation. That smile hurt almost more than my son's words. It told me this wasn't spontaneous. This was planned. This was encouraged. I remember noticing stupid details in that moment, the way the sunlight reflected off the lake through the windows, the faint smell of citrus from the table, the sound of someone clearing their throat behind me. My son sat back down, visibly relieved, like he'd just completed an assignment. No one clapped, but no one defended me either. A few people avoided my eyes. Others watched me with thinly veiled curiosity, as if waiting to see whether I'd break. I wanted to say something, anything, but my voice wouldn't come. I felt reduced, stripped of context, of years of late nights, sacrifices, quiet support that never looked impressive from the outside. In that room, I wasn't a father anymore, just a man being politely erased. I stood there, surrounded by people, never having felt so completely alone. The silence after his speech stretched long enough to feel physical, and instead of filling it with anger or disbelief, I felt something settle inside me that surprised even myself, a kind of cold clarity that pushed everything else aside. I set my glass down carefully, aware of how steady my hands were, and reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I had brought the folder with me almost as an afterthought, something I told myself I probably wouldn't need, but the weight of it felt oddly reassuring as I opened it and pulled out the document. A few people leaned forward instinctively, sensing something else was happening, though none of them understood what it was yet. I looked at my son and spoke evenly, asking him if he was absolutely sure this was what he wanted, if he understood that choosing to formally renounce my surname wasn't symbolic, that it had legal consequences tied to the family trust he had benefited from his entire life. My voice didn't shake, and I didn't raise it, which seemed to confuse him more than if I had yelled. Laura laughed softly, shaking her head, and said I was being dramatic, that I was turning an emotional moment into some unnecessary legal theater. Her tone invited the room to see me as petty rather than cautious, and a few people chuckled uncomfortably in response. I slid the document across the table anyway, explaining calmly that it was a voluntary surname renunciation waiver, witnessed and binding, and that if he truly didn't want my name, this was the correct way to make that choice. I told him he didn't have to sign anything, that we could talk privately later, but the words barely registered. His stepfather leaned in, murmuring encouragement about independence and standing by his convictions, while Laura nodded approvingly, reinforcing the idea that this was a powerful, adult decision. My son's jaw tightened, pride taking over, and he reached for the pen without asking a single question. He didn't read the document. Not a line. He signed where I indicated, his handwriting quick and careless, as if lingering might somehow weaken his resolve. I watched him closely, not with anger, but with a quiet sadness that felt heavier than anything I'd experienced earlier that day. When he finished, I took the paper back, checked the signature, and noted aloud that the choice had been made voluntarily and witnessed by everyone present. The room was completely silent now, the earlier tension replaced by something far more uncomfortable. I closed the folder, thanked the hosts for having me in a voice that remained polite, almost detached, and turned toward the door. No speeches followed, no final remarks, no dramatic exit. I didn't look back at Laura, and I didn't wait to see my son's expression change. I simply walked out of the house, past the glass walls and the view of the lake, leaving behind the noise, the judgment, and the version of myself they had already decided no longer mattered. That night my house felt unusually quiet, not peaceful, just empty in a way that made every sound sharper, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, the floorboards creaking as I moved from room to room without really knowing why. I didn't turn on the television or pour a drink, and I didn't sit down right away. I placed the signed document on my desk and looked at it for a long time, not with doubt, but with the strange detachment that comes after something irreversible has already happened. Whatever emotions I might have had were spent earlier that day, burned out in that room full of smiling faces. Eventually I picked up my phone and called my estate attorney, a man I had worked with for decades, someone who knew my life in clauses and contingencies better than most people ever had. He answered despite the late hour, his voice alert the moment he heard mine, as if he already sensed this wasn't a casual call. I told him I needed to activate a dormant provision in the family trust, one that had been drafted years earlier and never once discussed with anyone else. He paused, not in surprise, but in confirmation, and asked me to verify which clause I meant. I stated it clearly, that the clause applied to any beneficiary who voluntarily renounced the Mercer name, fully aware of the legal definition of voluntary and the documentation required to prove it. There was another pause, heavier this time, and he reminded me, carefully and professionally, what that activation would mean. He listed it methodically: the loss of inheritance, the immediate termination of education funding, the removal of healthcare coverage tied to the trust, the elimination of any future business succession rights, and the permanent exclusion from all trust distributions, present and future. There were no dramatics in his tone, just precision, as if reading out the side effects of a powerful medication. I listened without interrupting, not because I needed the explanation, but because it felt appropriate to let the words exist in the air. When he finished, he asked me one final time if I wanted to proceed, emphasizing that once executed, the decision could not be reversed without unanimous trustee approval, something he knew was structurally impossible. I told him to proceed. There was no hesitation in my voice, no tremor, no need to justify myself. The decision had already been made the moment that pen touched paper earlier that day. He confirmed the authorization, explained that the system would begin updating overnight, notifications triggering automatically, accounts freezing, designations being amended, all without drama or announcement. By morning, the legal reality would be in place, indifferent to feelings or intentions. I thanked him and ended the call, setting the phone down gently on the desk as if noise itself felt unnecessary. I sat there for a long time afterward, staring at nothing in particular, aware that something fundamental had shifted, not because of what I had just done, but because of what had been chosen for me earlier. The house remained quiet, unchanged, while somewhere beyond it, the legal system moved efficiently and without emotion, doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The consequences didn't announce themselves with a single dramatic moment, they crept in quietly, almost politely, unfolding over a matter of days in a way that made them impossible to argue with or dismiss. I wasn't there to witness the first realization, but I was informed of it through the same channels that now treated everything as procedural rather than personal. His debit card stopped working without warning, declined at places he had never once considered a limit, and at first he assumed it was a technical issue, a glitch that would resolve itself with a phone call or a visit to a bank branch. When it didn't, irritation replaced confusion, followed by the expectation that someone else would handle it for him, because someone always had. The emails began arriving soon after, automated but unmistakably direct, notifying him that his college tuition coverage had been terminated effective immediately and that his account now reflected a balance due in full. Scholarships connected to the Mercer Foundation were formally revoked, their language cold and standardized, citing eligibility requirements no longer met. There was no accusation in those messages, no moral framing, just statements of fact and deadlines. Each email added weight to a situation he still believed was temporary, something that could be fixed once the right adult stepped in and made a call. He turned to his stepfather with confidence, repeating the word fix as if it were a guarantee rather than a hope, fully convinced that money was money and that influence worked the same everywhere. What he didn't understand was that none of this had ever been casual generosity, none of it flexible or improvised, and none of it belonged to the household he now identified with. Behind closed doors, Laura's composure fractured quickly as she started asking questions she should have asked years earlier, only to realize that every answer led to the same conclusion. The trust assets were never marital property, never shared, never something she had legal standing over, no matter how long she had benefited from proximity to them. The panic stayed off stage at first, hidden behind reassurances and forced calm, but it was real and escalating. Calls were made, messages sent, assumptions tested and quietly rejected by legal reality. There was no appeal process, no discretionary review, no sympathetic administrator waiting to be persuaded. Everything had been structured deliberately, and now it was executing exactly as designed. I received confirmation updates as systems adjusted, accounts closed, benefits terminated, and designations removed, each notice written in language that made it clear this wasn't punishment, just consequence. From my side, there was no satisfaction in it, but there was a stark sense of inevitability. What had been dismissed as drama at that brunch table was now manifesting as invoices, declined transactions, and revoked privileges that no amount of confidence could override. The shock wasn't just financial, it was structural, the sudden collapse of an assumed safety net that had always been mistaken for permanence. And while outwardly they searched for solutions, I knew there were none left to find, because nothing had broken, and nothing needed fixing. I wasn't in the room with Laura, but I received a detailed summary afterward, delivered in the same neutral tone my attorney used for everything, and it painted a picture I could see with uncomfortable clarity. She had gone into that meeting confident, still operating under the belief that money could be negotiated and that influence could soften hard edges, only to sit across from a man who dealt exclusively in documents and outcomes. He laid everything out for her without malice, explaining the full scope of what had been lost, not in abstract terms, but in numbers and structures that left very little room for interpretation. Over $20 million in lifetime assets, education pathways, medical coverage, trust distributions, future business equity, all of it gone the moment that waiver was executed. He explained that the clause was irrevocable by design, written specifically to remove emotion, pressure, and hindsight from the equation. He reminded her that the renunciation had been public, voluntary, and encouraged, witnessed by dozens of people, and documented in a manner that exceeded the legal standard required. Her attempt to frame it as a family misunderstanding didn't hold up against the facts, especially not after he pointed out that she herself had openly supported the decision, even celebrating it as an act of self-expression. That detail mattered, because it eliminated any argument of coercion or manipulation from my side. She asked about appeals, exceptions, loopholes, anything that might allow a reversal, and each question was met with the same calm answer. There was no legal path back. The trust had done exactly what it was designed to do, and the legal system recognized it as valid, enforceable, and final. By the time the meeting ended, the confidence she walked in with had evaporated, replaced by a kind of stunned silence that no reassurance could touch. When she left the office, she wasn't angry anymore, at least not outwardly. According to my attorney, she looked disoriented, like someone who had just realized the ground beneath them had been solid all along and they were the ones who chose to step off it. For the first time, the scale of her arrogance became impossible to ignore, not because someone accused her of it, but because the consequences were now fully visible and undeniable. I didn't take any pleasure in that realization, but I also didn't feel responsible for it. The choice had been made publicly, proudly, and without hesitation, and all I had done was respect it fully. The first attempts to reach me were indirect and clumsy, driven more by panic than understanding, and I became aware of them only because systems did what they were designed to do. He tried to enter my gated home one afternoon and was stopped at the entrance, his name no longer clearing security, his calls to the intercom unanswered because there was nothing to forward them to. He waited there for hours, according to the report I received later, pacing, sitting, standing again, convinced that persistence alone would eventually override procedure. It didn't. The gate never opened. When that failed, he went to the family business offices, a place he had once walked through freely without appointments or explanations. This time he was treated like any other unregistered visitor, asked to wait, then politely told there was no one available to see him. Executives who had known him since childhood refused to intervene, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing for them to intervene in. The instructions were clear, and no one was willing to risk their position by pretending otherwise. He left frustrated and confused, still clinging to the belief that this was all a misunderstanding that could be corrected once he spoke to me directly. That finally happened at the cemetery, of all places, where I had gone alone to visit a grave I rarely talked about. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see him standing there, eyes red, composure gone, pride stripped away by reality. He didn't start with accusations or speeches this time. He begged. The word fit the moment uncomfortably well. He talked about mistakes, about pressure, about not realizing what he was doing, his words tumbling over each other as if speed might undo what had already settled into place. I listened without interrupting, my voice calm when I finally spoke, not because I felt detached, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. I told him this wasn't punishment, not revenge, not anger delayed and disguised. I explained that what he experienced wasn't emotional fallout but structure, the same structure that had supported him for years without being noticed. He had wanted freedom from my name, freedom from what it represented, and that choice came with a framework he had chosen not to examine at the time. I reminded him gently that the decision was his, made publicly, confidently, and with witnesses, and that respecting it fully was the only honest response I could give. I didn't raise my voice or harden my tone, and I didn't soften the truth either. The name, the benefits, the protection, they were never separate things. He stood there silently as the meaning settled in, finally understanding that there was no lever left to pull, no authority left to appeal to. When I left the cemetery, I did so alone, just as I had arrived, aware that something permanent had passed between us, not because I enforced it, but because it had been chosen. The decision stood, not as a judgment, but as a boundary, and boundaries, once crossed deliberately, do not move simply because regret arrives late. Time has a way of smoothing sharp moments into something duller but heavier, and as the months passed, the new reality settled in quietly, without ceremony or announcement. Graduation came and went without me in attendance, my absence unnoticed by some and deeply felt by others, though I wasn't informed directly, only made aware through the same distant channels that now delivered updates without commentary. He crossed a stage knowing I wasn't there, knowing why, and whatever story he told himself about that moment had to exist without my presence to reinforce it. Not long after, he enrolled in a community college, a practical decision framed as temporary, though the word temporary had started to lose its meaning by then. The luxury penthouse they still lived in began to feel less like a symbol of success and more like a waiting room, expensive but unstable, its costs increasingly difficult to justify as financial pressure crept in from every direction. Laura took a low-paying job for the first time in years, something she reportedly described as humbling, though the humility came less from the work itself and more from the realization that there was no safety net left beneath her. The lifestyle she had once defended so confidently now required constant adjustment, compromises she had never imagined needing to make. The stepfather's wealth, once spoken about with admiration and certainty, revealed itself slowly for what it was, a structure propped up by leverage and appearances rather than ownership, impressive on the surface but fragile underneath. As expenses tightened and credit lines became conversations instead of assumptions, the image of stability he had projected lost its shine. Confidence without backing proved to be a poor substitute for actual resources, and that lesson arrived far too late to be useful. Meanwhile, the video from that brunch resurfaced and spread, clipped, reposted, stripped of context and reshaped by strangers who didn't know any of us but understood enough to draw conclusions. The confident declaration that had once felt powerful became something else entirely online, analyzed and criticized, turned into a cautionary tale rather than a triumph. My son's words followed him now, detached from the room they were spoken in, reaching people who would never forget them even if he wanted to. From where I stood, the changes weren't dramatic, but they were definitive. The world adjusted, expectations recalibrated, and what had once been assumed as permanent revealed itself as conditional. I didn't intervene, didn't comment, and didn't correct narratives, because nothing about this phase required my involvement. The new reality wasn't cruel, it was simply honest, and honesty, once established, has a way of maintaining itself without assistance. Months passed, not marked by dramatic milestones but by routine, and in that routine I found something steadier than closure. Most mornings I spent time at the warehouse, not in an office behind glass but on the floor itself, walking the aisles, checking inventory, speaking to people who understood the business because they worked inside it rather than around it. My niece started coming with me during that time, young enough to still listen and old enough to ask questions that mattered, and I taught her the things no document could ever explain: why accountability mattered more than image, why the family name was never about privilege but about consistency, about showing up even when no one was watching. She learned quickly, not because she was exceptional, but because she was willing, and that willingness reminded me of why the legacy existed in the first place. The business continued to grow quietly, contracts renewing, partnerships strengthening, the trust expanding through patience rather than spectacle. Nothing needed rescuing, nothing needed repairing, because what remained had always been solid. Systems held, values aligned, and the structure did exactly what it was meant to do: support those who respected it and remain indifferent to those who did not. Somewhere beyond that, my son lived a life entirely separate from the one he had rejected, navigating independence without the buffers he once mistook for guarantees. I didn't monitor it and I didn't interfere, not out of coldness, but because distance was now part of the framework he had chosen. Independence, real independence, carried costs that no one could subsidize without undermining its meaning, and those costs were not mine to absorb anymore. What surprised me most was the absence of hatred. I expected anger to linger, to resurface in quiet moments, but it didn't. What replaced it was acceptance, not resignation, but a clear understanding that legacy isn't about blood alone and never has been. It's about alignment, about shared standards and mutual respect for what was built and why. The name endures because it adapts without abandoning itself, because it belongs to those who carry it forward intentionally, not automatically. As I watched my niece take pride in small responsibilities, correcting mistakes without excuses, I felt something settle that hadn't been present in a long time. Not victory, not loss, just continuity. The family name continued, strengthened by choice rather than obligation, and I understood then that legacy doesn't disappear when someone walks away from it. It simply moves forward without them, unchanged in purpose, patient enough to wait for those who understand what it truly represents.